The abolition of regional spatial strategies clearly government sees as an important part of its localist agenda. Indeed, parts of the proposals to abolish the RSSs and put other measures in place are in the localism bill, which is also going through Parliament at the same time. Government says, and the Local Government Association was very supportive of this, that they wanted to abolish top-down targets and allow local communities to come up with their own solutions. Though one of the first things I'll say in slight contradiction to that, and I'll say a number of things in contradiction perhaps to what the Secretary of State would say if he was here, actually the regional spatial strategies assessments were based on a collection of information from local authorities. It wasn't simply plucked out of the air at regional level. There was an attempt to collect from local authorities what they saw as housing needs in their area, pull it at regional level, and then disseminate it back. But anyway, that's what government is getting rid of in the name of localism. And actually, most of the local plans currently around, the local development frameworks, are not part of this process at all, because local authorities by and large are still relying on the old unitary development plans, which were drawn up before the regional spatial strategies were thought of. So there's a bit of a misunderstanding about exactly what local authorities are working to at present. Even when the RSSs are abolished, of course, there will still be a need for local authorities to do an assessment of need in their area. The Minister for Planning and Decentralisation, Greg Clark, has now tightened up that requirement to try and make it more robust, because it's absolutely essential that whoever does a needs assessment, one is done on a proper basis of housing need in an area, and indeed all of the needs as well. One of the problems that still remains, however, is will that needs assessment be consistent between one authority and another? Or will some authorities actually be attempted, and perhaps under local pressure, to do a slightly less robust needs assessment and reduce the number of houses they think needs to be built in their area? That's one of the questions, of course, that only time will tell. Also, I think one of our concerns is that at a time of local government financial constraint, particularly for smaller authorities, are they going to have the capacity in terms of planning skills to actually do the needs assessment for themselves? Currently they can draw down and blame, if they want to, what's done at regional level. But in future, if they're going to have to do their own, are particularly some small authorities going to get into some difficulties because of not having the resources to do it. But the biggest question, of course, of all, and it's one we've pushed government ministers on, is what happens when all these needs assessments are done, and if they're written then into local plans, and then that forms the basis for planning decisions, the sum total of what local authorities think need to be done in terms of house building doesn't meet the government's national requirements. Now, what happens if the sum total, you add up all the local plans throughout the country and all the houses they think needs to be built, and that doesn't hit the government's national requirements? Well, the government began by saying, of course, we don't have a target for house building at national level. And so one of the questions we put to government ministers, and I say we tend to treat them as a bit of hostile witnesses when they come before a select committee, and I asked the housing minister this. I said, well, exactly, therefore, what is the point of abolishing the current planning arrangements? Is it because you think not enough houses are being built? And he said, yes, of course. So I said, well, therefore, the objective of this is to build more houses in the future than were being built by the last government before the recession. And he said, precisely. So the government actually has a housing target, and it's to build more houses in the future than were being built before the recession. So what happens if the sum total of the needs assessments of every individual local authority doesn't add up to the figure the government has now set as its housing target? Well, again, we pushed the housing minister on this, and the only thing he said was there is no plan B, but I suppose we might have to increase the level of the new homes bonus to incentivise people more to build the houses that are needed. Well, we pushed him therefore on the new homes bonus, which is the other key aspect of the reform of the system. The need's going to be done by local level. Local communities, local councils will make decisions about the houses to be built, but they're going to be incentivised by the lure of extra money through the new homes bonus. Though, to some extent, in totality, that's a little bit of an unfair way of looking at it, because actually most of the new homes bonus is top sliced from local government's grants, so they're simply going to get their own money back by another mechanism. But anyway, that's what the minister said. The problem is when we also pushed about whether there was any evidence from research the government had done, or any evidence from anywhere else in the world, that this sort of incentive to encourage house building worked, probably wasn't surprised to say there wasn't any. Not a single bit of evidence that ministers could come forward with to say that new homes bonus would actually incentivise local authorities to build the number of homes that were needed. Indeed, some of the evidence we had, and again, a bit of this is people's personal opinion, I accept at this stage, were that if you look at seriously what a new homes bonus would do and where local authorities were coming from, those local authorities that wanted to build would probably build anyway and say, thank you very much, you're now paying us for doing it. And those local authorities that didn't want to build would not probably find the incentive of the new homes bonus great enough to actually encourage them to build more. As one of our witnesses said, if the bonus is large enough to be effective, it won't be affordable to the government. If it's affordable, then it won't be effective, because the level would have to be increased so much to actually encourage those authorities that don't want to build to actually build the number of homes that are necessary to hit the national targets. And rather worryingly, the National Housing Federation, and I have to say, when you get the National Housing Federation representing housing associations and the Home Builders Federation representing the home builders and Shelter representing the homeless and disadvantaged, all coming to a committee and giving the same evidence and agreeing with each other, you perhaps begin to click that maybe the government hasn't got this absolutely right. But the National Housing Federation has done some detailed research, and they believe up to date there are probably about 200,000 planning permissions for housing that haven't been given by local authorities that would have been given under the present system. I agree there's an element of subjectivity, but they've gone to local councils and talked to them in some detail. And the National House Builders Federation, the builders, are saying very similar thing to us in their evidence. They're already seeing evidence of fewer planning permissions being given on sites they would have thought would have been given permission in the past. Now, it is a complicated situation. We don't know whether the change of planning approach is totally responsible for that, but of course we are living in a time when the demand for housing in the current economic circumstances has fallen away, when people are finding it very difficult, particularly first-time buyers, to get mortgages. So that may be an effect as well. There may not simply be the requests coming through. But the research the NHF tried to take some of that out by looking at where requests were being turned down or stalled or whatever. And I think there is an underlying problem there that perhaps we'll have to wait to see if it comes about. There is another slightly worrying aspect to the new homes bonus. The government have now legislated to say that the new homes bonus can be taken as a material consideration where it is as part of a planning application. And I know a number of people feel, and the Select Committee felt as well, that where you get into taking into account a financial incentive as part of a decision about an individual planning application, you are potentially changing the basis of planning law very fundamentally in this country. It's very different if a local authority looks at the availability of the homes bonus and in coming to a view about its local plan and the number of houses to be built within it, it takes account of the financial incentives there, providing therefore it's saying, yes, this money is coming in, and it's part of the package of doing a proper assessment of the houses needed in our area and how we accommodate those in the local plan. It's very different to say, here is an application, do we accept it or not, because of the financial incentives that are there. I think all of us want to see more homes for sale, but we don't want the impression to be given that planning permissions are for sale. And I think that is something that is worrying, that I don't think government's really seen through in terms of a change to the way that planning is perceived by the public. And I think it will be not too long before constituents start coming to councillors and to MPs and saying, you only gave that permission, didn't you, because you were paid to do it. And I think that is something that is concerning. We all know there's been 106 agreements in the past, but they've generally been about conditions to an application, negotiated on something where a decision in principle has been taken to be given. So there are other concerns. There's a concern I mentioned about the top slicing and the new homes bonus, and that essentially, if it is true that in the end more houses have been built, and this is one of the big questions, in areas of growth and relative affluence, that you will end up redistributing money from poorer areas to richer areas, and that is a concern as well. But on top of all this, of course, we've got the neighbourhood plans and the further approach to localism. The new homes bonus and developing needs assessment at local level is localism, but then we've got the neighbourhood plans as well. And to some extent, I think the impression has been given to people that if in their community they don't want any houses built or they don't want a Tesco, they don't have to have it. And I'm not sure how far neighbourhood plans will take off. I think they will in some parts of the country, in some areas. One of the worries is that it will take off in areas where actually there are people in the community who've got a bit of expertise, a bit of time on their hands, and a bit of financial resource. Again, it'll be in more affluent areas. It's not likely many inner city communities you'll see them drawing up local plans, having the wherewithal to do it. So a concern there that isn't seen through as a strategic whole. But also, I think, a concern that once people draw these neighbourhood plans up and think they have a right to stop development, they will hit the very big barrier that those neighbourhood plans have to be in conformity with, consistency with, the local development framework for the area, the local plan for the area that the council has drawn up. So there won't be quite that degree of freedom at neighbourhood level, and that's providing you can decide what a neighbourhood is. I've just drawn attention in some of the talks I've done to Tesco planning application in my own constituency. You would get a very different view of it, whether you ask the houses on the estate immediately next door to the site, where they probably don't want it. If you ask the polling district area, which is about 3 or 4 times as large, people will probably be split. If you ask the ward, most people will say, thank you very much, we don't live too near to be bothered by it, but we would like another supermarket in the area to give a bit of choice and competition. And a few jobs as well. So you get a very different view as to what the neighbourhood was defined as. So I think there are problems around that as well. But in the end, because people may be feeling they're given a power of veto through this process in their neighbourhood when they aren't, there's a real potential for conflicts between councils and communities, particularly if you throw in the buying, as it will be seen, the planning permissions with a new home bonus attached. I think there are real concerns about this as well. And then, of course, you've got to take into account that while at one level the whole process has been pulled down to the neighbourhood level, at another level the government's now accepted as part of the localism bill that you can't see planning in the isolation of one individual local authority alone. And it's one of the things we talked about, this vacuum. You've got to have a wider vision for many views, particularly at a sub-regional level. You've got to have a vision about housing, you've got to have a vision about jobs, you've got to have a vision about transport systems, and you can't do that on an individual local authority level. So there has this duty to cooperate, which the government put in place of the regional spatial strategies, is now going to be strengthened. It probably isn't strengthened far enough, but if you're saying on the one hand, neighbourhood planning, it should be done at that level, the views of the community is important, and then you're saying, well, actually, when we start talking to other authorities in our area, we believe because there are real demands for housing in the next door authority, but they've got virtually no land to build on, we've got to take more building in our area to compensate. That you can see the potential for conflicts around here, which are going to materialise. And in some ways, this attempt to reinvent community involvement in planning, we ought to look what's happening already. The best authorities, when they draw their local plans up, already do a lot of consulting with their communities about where housing should be located. And actually, if you do it in the wider sense, you can sometimes get people to recognise the choice isn't whether you build houses or not, but where you build them in a local authority area. And I think that's a much more appropriate way to do it. But I think that the potential for tensions between the various aspects of government policy, between neighbourhood plans and local plans, a duty to cooperate on a wider level, and the national housing needs which government has to address, with whether those will be addressed by the sum totals of all the various parts of local decision making is difficult. Then, of course, we have this presumption in favour of development, because it almost seems as though the government have got a localist agenda, and then suddenly decided, well, actually, what about growth? Haven't we got a few problems with growth? The economy doesn't seem to be growing very fast. The idea that somehow the private sector is going to fill the vacuum created by the cuts in the public sector doesn't seem to be happening. So we've got the Regional Growth Fund and one or two initiatives, the tax increment financing, the enterprise zones, and also this presumption in favour of development. Though actually when I look at what it's said in outline, that you've got to prepare local plans on the basis that objectively assessed development needs should be met. Well, that's actually what they should be doing anyway. That you approve development proposals in accord with statutory plans without delay. That's actually what should be happening anyway. And you should grant permission where the plan is absent, silent, indeterminate, or where relevant policies are out of date. Well, I ask a few lawyers in this room what an out-of-date policy or plan was, and I think I might get several different views from several different lawyers. I really start to worry that some of it almost seems to be made up as an afterthought, that, oh dear, if we give all this power down to local communities and local councils, we might not get the end results at national level that we want, we might not get the growth that we want, and therefore we have to do something to stick on top of this. And again, the various conflicts between the elements of the changes, I think, are concerning. Will it speed up the planning process? Well, certainly if we're going to have neighbourhood plans and we have to wait for those, it probably won't. If we get more refusals at local level, which we might well do so because local councils now being a bit more empowered and haven't got the regional special strategies to direct them in terms of need, then we probably end up with more appeals and more challenges. The amount of conflicts in the system I've identified might lead to more appeals and challenges. And of course, one thing we should learn in planning is that any change creates uncertainty, and any uncertainty leads to a slowdown in the system. And there is some evidence already, if you add on top of the way in which has this been handled, with the regional spatial strategies being announced as abolished, then the court case, which everyone will be aware of, challenging that, and then now regional spatial strategies are back in place, but only till the localism bill goes through. That of itself creates enormous uncertainty, and developers may well be holding off until they're clear about what the certainty of the arrangements is. So certainly in the short term, it's not speeded things up. Indeed, if we look back to the 2004 Planning Act, which brought in the local development frameworks, they were brought in, and I remember talking to Charlie Faulkner, the minister at the time. His real concern was that local authorities weren't speedy enough in getting on and proposing their unitary development plans. So in 2004, we changed from unitary development plans to local development frameworks, and 7 years later, guess what? Most local authorities haven't got a local development framework in place. What we learn is that change happens fairly slowly, and that can have an adverse impact on applications coming forward and being approved. And the other thing we ought to learn from that is that that significant change in the 2004 legislation, of course, did have proper transitional arrangements from one system to another. One of the things that we highlighted in the current proposals is there are no effective transitional frameworks within the legislation. So what I'm trying to do today is to, I think, highlight a lot of on the committee's concerns about this. We don't know in the end what's going to happen. We don't know whether more houses will be built or less. We are concerned that the proposals will reduce the number of houses being built in this country. We might be proved to be wrong. We hope that we are. But I think our job was to take the evidence before us from a whole range of organisations which raised a lot of concerns from professional bodies, from builders, from other housing providers, to say, yes, government, we're not sure you've got this right. Now, it may well be that in producing this report, we didn't hit the press headlines, and we got good coverage in the trade and professional press, but the tabloids perhaps didn't see this as an immediately sexy enough topic to write their headlines with. Our concern is if our concerns are right about what the current planning proposals amount to and what they may produce, is that in 3 or 4 years' time, the tabloids may be writing headlines about the effect of these policies on a reduction in house building in this country. We hope our concerns aren't proven to be true. Our concern is they might just be proven to be true, and that will cause major problems for housing provision and supply in this country in the future. Thanks very much indeed.